Okay, so as we know, there have been some changes recently with the National Association of Realtors. We've had a lot of people asking about this as they're trying to figure out how this might affect them. So, what is the NAR settlement exactly?
I maybe I'll start. I'm not going to get into the full like explanation, but I think for simple terms, all it's really doing, it's just changing uh, how commission is being paid, to be quite simplest. Meaning, previously, in what was happening when a listing agent met with the seller, they were signing a commission agreement usually for 5-6%, and then that listing broker was cooperating with the buyer broker and giving usually half of that 5 or 6 to the buyer broker. So the payment was going from the seller to the seller's broker, and then the seller broker was paying the buyer's broker. That's no longer allowed. Now the payment goes from the seller if the seller chooses to pay the buyer's broker. So it skips over the listing broker, and the seller can pay directly to the buyer's broker if they choose to, or they can offer a seller concession to cover the buyer's broker commission that the buyer is paying for themselves, right? So that's the simplest way to explain it. And I'll let Craig add to it because he's also a realtor and he does sales too. So anything you would add to clarify this a little further without getting
No,
too
I don't
deep
think it
into
makes
it?
sense to get too deep into the weeds of the background of the settlement. I mean, obviously the next question I think is the big one that people want to ask. So I'll let you ask that one, Rebecca, and then I can jump in too.
Yes, so yeah, that is the big question. How does it impact a seller and a buyer when it comes to an assumption?
Right. So I've actually had some agents ask me this, right? Because we could be in a scenario where a home is for sale and the seller is not offering to pay the agent that brings the buyer to that sale a fee. And quite frankly, I don't know anybody who's going to do any work without getting paid in any industry, much less the real estate industry, right? And so that buyer's broker may have to go back to his buyer and say, hey, if you want my help in this deal, here is the fee that you'd have to pay me. Well, with VA loans, traditionally it has been that buyers could not pay commission, right? But the VA did come out and say that they were going to, one, put a hold on that rule and likely come up with some rules that change that, because the VA does not want their veterans to be disadvantaged in buying homes against people getting a conventional mortgage, right? And so that is going to ultimately change. But I also don't think that it benefits a seller to push any potential buyer away, because what I'm seeing in the real estate market right now, there are buyer brokers who are calling listing brokers and trying to say, okay, are you offering a co-op commission of whatever percentage, right? And I can imagine what is going on is that brokers that are saying, no, we are not offering one, that buyer broker goes, okay, thank you, hangs up the phone and never sets a showing because their buyer client cannot afford to not only bring their down payment, maybe their closing costs, and a buyer agent commission. So that's not a house for them to buy. So they're going to get handicapped, and from my view, if they're not willing to incentivize buyer brokers to bring their buyers to see their homes. So the impact I see is just, I guess, maybe more negotiation clarity in how commissions are paid. I don't think it's simplified things for buyers or sellers personally. But it's just one more piece to be cognizant of and reason to have good guidance in a real estate transaction. You know, I mean, another reason for people to reach out to you guys at Assumable Sales to get connected with good agents around the country who can explain this and go over this in detail with how it's going to work. But it shouldn't, the NAR settlement should not be something that makes people shy away from chasing assumptions, because it's not going to affect them any differently than if they were not chasing an assumable mortgage.
Okay, thank you for that.
And I would just add one more thing. Another thing that might be a concern, like, well, if the seller gives, you know, if we ask for a concession from the seller to cover my buyer broker's, you know, commission, right? Does that mean that I can't get concessions to cover my closing costs like I was able to do with a VA loan before? And the good news is the answer is no, there is actually no negative impact. This is one of the changes that the Veterans Administration and actually FHA too made, is that they said, look, we have certain caps, right? So, you know, depending on how much down payment you put down, but let's just say it's somewhere between 4 to 6% is maximum for seller's concession for, depending if it's a VA loan or FHA loan, down payment. So there's different variables there. However, what you need to know is that if you're going to ask for an additional seller's concession on top of your closing costs, and it's to cover the buyer's agent's commission, that is a completely separate fee that they're not gonna, that will have no negative impact on the cap that's been established for decades for you.
Well, to speak to that, Randy, too, though, with the national, or with the cap that you mentioned there, you know, your closing cost and assumption are far lower, right? You're cutting out a lot of the traditional closing costs that relate to a new loan when you do an assumption. And so there's actually a pretty good amount of that cap that, if needed in a negotiation, could go towards potential commissions that a buyer would have to pay, because you know, they're not going to be paying a lot of the funding for a new loan. So
yeah, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is that one has nothing to do with the other. So
right, true.
That's it. You can separate it, and the VA and FHA does not care if you're going to ask for an additional seller concession percentage to cover the buyer broker.
Yes.
It's completely separate, which is good news to you, the buyer, right?
All right. Well, thank you, Randy and Craig, for joining us for this Q&A.